All right, good morning. Can you hear me? All right, wow, it's a little life, not what I expected. Well, I've got my tablet here, and it's got my notes for the message. But as a backup, tablets sometimes are not reliable. I brought a hard copy just in case. And then to be fully prepared, I thought, I don't know how long it's going to take to get through these notes. So just to be prepared, I brought my lunch here. And Harriet, this is just for you since she threatened me, But you did give me a 2 o'clock deadline, so no, this is for a visual aid later. But I thought I'd pull it out just to pique your interest. And also, Aaron, there is a Spider-Man on the cover, since I know Aaron is a big fan, as I was too as a kid. Spidey is number one superhero. Well, let me park this down here. And that opening video we just watched, it kind of posed a question to all of us, which was, how do you respond to a challenge? There were 3 options, you noticed. Number 1, I think, was challenge accepted, bring it on. Number 2 was, I think, no way, I'm not taking anything extra on. And number 3 was maybe, more information needed. Now, I'm not going to embarrass everyone by asking you to raise your hand for all 3, but I am a little curious about the third question, maybe more information needed. How many of you thought to yourself, that's me? Wow, now I'm curious. I thought everyone was going to raise their hand on that one. Well, that would probably be me. I'm not overly brave. I'm not a complete coward, but, I can be convinced sometimes. And so we're going to be talking about big challenges today. And, what does it take to change your mind or open your mind to taking on something you normally wouldn't? Have you ever noticed that Jesus often challenged his disciples to do things that were just beyond their natural abilities? Often they failed. I mean, it's almost comical at times. You think of that scene, it's in Matthew chapter 4, verse 19. You'll probably recognize it, where Jesus says to some would-be disciples, fishermen, "Come follow me, and I will send you out to fish for people." If you grew up with the King James Version like I did, it says, Jesus says, "I will make you fishers of men." But wait a minute. These guys who were professional fishermen just spent the entire night before trying to catch fish, and they couldn't catch anything. And yet somehow Jesus picks them out of a lineup and says, "Those are the guys I want. They can't catch fish, but come with me, you'll catch people." Yeah, there's another scene later where Jesus asked the disciples to row their boat a few miles across kind of a northern tip of the Galilean Sea. He says, "I'm going to walk around the shore, but I'll meet you over there." And these are seasoned men of the sea. And, they just get a little ways out, and suddenly they're caught off guard by a storm. They're afraid for their lives. And I think there's a part of us that just kind of, I don't know about you, I just kind of identify with these guys because often I think, that's me. I tend to mess things up more than I'd like to admit. But maybe one of the best examples of Jesus asking them to do more than they really were qualified for is found in Matthew chapter 14. This is going to be the main text we look at today, and we're not going to get into it quite yet, but I kind of wanted to tee it up a little bit. If you went to Sunday school, this is probably one you heard again and again. It's a favorite. It's a scene where Jesus, he's been teaching thousands of people and healing. It's been a long day. Imagine the sun is setting and they're tired, and the disciples are thinking, man, we need a dinner break. And so they go to Jesus, and they say here in Matthew chapter 14, verse 15, Jesus, send the crowds away so that we can go to the villages and buy themselves, they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food. And I just imagine Jesus, he kind of looks out at that tired crowd, he smiles to himself, and he turns to the disciples and he says, "I have a better idea. They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." I've heard that story dozens of times, and I think I've always glossed over that one line where Jesus says, "I want you to give them something to eat." And I'm sure they're thinking, with what? Is he kidding? There he goes again. So let's put that story on hold. We're going to come back to it, but I want to just do a little bit of a recap here on where we are in this faith series. Some of you may not have been here in previous weeks, but we're talking about building your faith. It's called Faith Full, Fueling Your Faith in a World on Empty. And I think when Kathy teed this off and Robert last week, one of the main messages has been that faith, real faith, is more than just mere belief. It is an active, alive, all-in, gritty, daily, relational, in the thick of things faith, hands-on. I think Robert said last week, if you believe something but you don't act on those beliefs, they're useless. And I think I would even go a step further and say, if you don't act on the things you believe, maybe that's a sign you don't really believe them in the first place. Well, Jesus invited us to embrace a faith that can be summed up in 2 words: follow me. Unfortunately, the church has sometimes kind of watered that down to saying faith is just merely believe in me. But I don't think Jesus ever intended, or he only intended, belief to be just the threshold to following. It's the launching pad. In fact, you may notice that often Jesus invited people to come follow him first before they believed. Come and see. He knew that if they just followed and observed, that their beliefs would be confirmed. And I've kind of become convinced that only by following, not just believing, can we ever see what God can really do. But following does require a certain amount of trust, doesn't it? Can I really trust God with the outcome of my life if I go out on a limb not knowing being out of control over what's going to happen? But I think, as we've said in the last 2 sessions, trust is the currency of relationship. Without trust, you can't have a relationship. And I'm convinced that, without trust, you can't have a relationship with God. You can't really know him. You can't really experience him. You can't step into the amazing life he has planned for you. Well-known speaker and author Tim Keller wrote a book some time ago called The Reason for God. I was going to say that's probably one of his best-known books, where he sets out to prove that Christianity is true. But in an interview he did with Frank Turek some time ago, he said, shortly after writing that book, I felt a need to write a prequel, which he did, called Making Sense of God. And he said, the ultimate question this book seeks to answer is not just, is Christianity true, but why does it even matter? And he makes a compelling case in this book that, and I think he's spot on, that Christianity, unlike any other worldview, any other belief system, any other religion, provides the most comprehensive and profound answers to life's deepest needs, the things we need more than anything as human beings. He lists a few. He says it gives us our answers to life's meaning, purpose, to our identity, our true identity, to freedom, inner freedom, justice, contentment, and hope. And yet none of those benefits of belief are real unless we act on our belief in faith and trust and follow Jesus. And I think here's the key. When we act in faith and our acts of faith are met with God's faithfulness, then our faith grows, our trust grows, and we begin to experience life in a whole new way. Sounds like exciting stuff, doesn't it? Well, we've set out and identified in this series on asking the question, what fuels and facilitates the development of active, enduring faith, saying there are 5 main things. There are more than 5, but 5 main things that can lead us down that path. Robert touched last week on the first, which was practical teaching. That it's not just enough to have true and accurate beliefs, although those are certainly important, but that we have to have teaching, practical teaching that is applicable where we're told and we can clearly know how to live that out in every area of our life. And unless we do that, faith doesn't grow. It's like a muscle. In fact, I have an image here, I think, Ed, if you can put it up. I had been doing some curls in the club, and I asked Jill to take a picture. That's where Robert, the drum roll, would be handy. He offered to do some little effects for me, but I took a pass. But imagine having faith like that. How strong you would be in the face of whatever life throws at you. But unless we exercise our faith by continually trusting God when we're not sure of the outcome and allowing Him to come through, without doing that, our faith doesn't grow. Well, this week we're going to delve into the second part of this, a second component of building our faith, which is really just a narrowing of the focus of practical teaching. And that is in having a personal ministry, investing ourselves in something that serves others, helps others in the name of Jesus. And in kind of getting into this topic, I thought I would tell you a little bit about my faith journey, because I think it kind of maybe helps illustrate this kind of connection between not practical teaching, certainly, but personal ministry and how vital those are to stepping into the life that God has planned for us. Now, like many of you, I grew up in church. When I was 8, I told the pastor there I believed some things, and my life didn't really change much after that. Honestly, I think I just wanted to drink the grape juice on Sunday mornings. I don't know if any of you can identify with that. I'd love a poll sometime that answers that question. But unsurprisingly, in high school, I had a crisis in faith. I mean, I started to ask those questions like, does He really exist? Is He real? And uncoincidentally, at the same time, I started to sense this emptiness and longing in my life. I thought, what's it all about? I mean, I imagined my future that I kind of had plotted out. I'm going to go to the local university, Marshall, probably hopefully get a good job, decent money, maybe have a steady girlfriend, get married, have money to buy my own place, to do some fun stuff on the weekends. And yet, as I imagined this future, it just seemed like pointless. It's nice, but is that really all there is? And I had this growing sense of emptiness in my life. In fact, it reached a critical point of almost desperation, I would say. And I thought, God, are you even in this mix? Where do you fit in? And so I decided one day, hey, I'm going to go out into the woods. Don't worry, this is not a suicide story or anything. I don't know, I just had that feeling that's where you thought this was going. No, I parked myself by a stream and I said, you know what, God, if you're real, I need you to show me. I mean, I'm just going to sit here and I'm going to wait you out. I want a sign. And I'm not sure what I was looking for. Maybe I thought Jesus was just going to show up strolling through the woods, or some kind of, temporal portal would open and an angel would come walking through. I was a sci-fi fan back then. Still are, yes. But, as you might suspect, that didn't happen. Nothing happened, it seemed, at least I thought. That was Saturday. The next Sunday morning, I get up, I go to church with my mom, because that's just what we did, to a little dying church in a depressed, small, boring town. And to my surprise, we had 4 visitors. They were young, vibrant people, and, they weren't angels, but maybe they should have been, or they could have easily played that same role. And I learned that they were part of a visiting contemporary music group that was doing an evangelistic series in the local high school. Now, in my town, man, we never had anything like that. And I often look back, what are the odds they show up the day after this showdown with God? And yet, there they were, and this guy approaches me, puts his hand on my shoulder. He says, "Hi, I'm Doug." And I'm a 17-year-old kid. I kind of pull back and go, who is this guy? But I'm intrigued by his genuineness and his warmth. And I find out later he's the piano player in the group. And I'm just learning to play piano. So he said, "Why don't you come see us this week?" So I went with a couple of friends, all 5 evenings. And honestly, I was blown away because in the stories they told, I mean, the music was great, but the stories they told about the life they were living, this adventure they were on, was a faith described unlike anything I'd ever heard. I mean, they illustrated a walk with Christ that was this personal friendship where he was someone you would just tell about everything in your life, involve him in every single decision, kind of seek his will and desire to just live it out to see what happened, where you become open to the needs and you start to see for the first time the needs and the brokenness of people around you. And they would describe these stories of reaching out and trying to lift people up and the joy that would come from seeing people whose burdens were lifted or who even came to Christ and were transformed as they were by his love. And I saw this incredible sense of mission and purpose and community and hope. And suddenly the light came on and I thought, that's what I've been missing. That's the life I was looking for. And that's what I want. And in looking back on that, it's just clear to me that their clear and practical teaching through their stories, their modeling of what it looked like to have a personal ministry was key in just changing the whole trajectory of my life and faith. I mean, I came out of the gate in this new walk realizing the only way to experience the life God has for us is to live it out and invest yourself in other people, to love God and love others. In fact, our mission statement at Grace is to love, serve, and grow. And I think, if you really love God, you love people, you're going to want to serve God. You're going to want to serve, grow. And it's only then we can experience the life we were meant to have. Now, it had never occurred to me at the time, but looking back now, I see these guys, this group that came to town, they were just a few years out of college. They weren't some big-time group. What they were doing was scary. It was a challenge. I mean, they came into a secular high school. Lots of unchurched kids showed up who were rowdy and unruly. I mean, their programs could have derailed and gone south very easily. And yet they took a chance. They stepped out in faith, and man, did God use them in a way that enriched their lives and mine. I should say it never occurred to me how scary that was until I got the bright idea and a nudge to maybe try doing the same thing. And those two friends that came with me, we said, let's start our own music group. Let's do what they do. That sounds easy. First time we were invited to sing at a bigger church in town for a Sunday evening service, I remember getting up, looking out at what seemed to be a sea of faces, and I looked down at the piano, and I mean, I couldn't even find middle key on that thing. I was so nervous. And I thought, God, how am I going to get through this? And yet I did, because of him. We started singing more. We went to college together. We were traveling in summers and doing concerts. And then this little country church called us one day from downstate Illinois, and they said, why don't you guys come and do a revival for us? I don't know if you know that word, but, a series of meetings aimed at really bringing people to Christ. It's going to have a youth emphasis. So we want music and preaching. And we're like, sure. And then suddenly after getting off the phone, wait a minute, who's going to preach? None of us had done more than 2 or 3 minutes of public speaking. And so we thought, well, let's all work up a sermon and we'll preach it to each other. So just picture, each guy taking his turns preaching to 2 other people. And I'd love to have a video of that because, anyway, I got elected by the group as the person least likely to totally embarrass himself. So we show up at the little church, and I mean, it's just packed, which doesn't help when you're nervous. You're thinking, maybe nobody will be there. And again, I was thinking, God, how am I going to do this? I feel like I can't even talk right now. And yet somehow God used that. He came through. And I remember the last night there was a young 18-year-old guy who shows up, unchurched, invited by someone, horrible life, so broken. And he came up to us afterwards and he said, I just love what I see. I want what you guys have. I want to follow Jesus. And that was one of the most joy-filled moments in my life. Something that was not focused on me, but on what was happening in his life. He even came back the fall. This was in the summer. That fall, he came to school with us. We went to a Christian college, and we continued to watch him grow and flourish in his faith. And so I came out of all those experiences just convinced more than ever that having a personal ministry, investing yourself in the lives of others, is so important to truly experiencing God and the richness and abundance He has, and growing our faith, and giving us a purpose in life that just becomes monumental. But let me ask you, what is your personal ministry? For me, it's been music a lot of my life and sharing, and it's changed over the years to a variety of things, which is common. And I look back, the only regrets I have really are those seasons where I kind of stopped taking those chances, stopped listening to those nudges, and got more fixated on my career or some pet hobby or interest. And you look back at those times and they feel like they never happened. There's not much memorable. But what is your personal ministry? Maybe it might be something totally different. Maybe you're someone who's good with his hands. You like to fix things. You would not want me to come over and help. So your personal ministry might be, you don't have to laugh so hard at that. Your personal ministry might be, helping other people who can't do that and maybe can't afford to pay someone to do it. I think of, maybe you have a burden for youth. I think of Jackie and Aaron who, there was a point when they felt this nudge to help with the youth. And that had to be a scary thing to do. It would be for me anyway, even though I once did it a lot. And God has blessed that effort. I think of, hang on, I just turned the page and I didn't mean to. I think of, Bill Manganera and Morgan back in the day saying, there's nothing for men right now, and men need to be able to connect with other men. They felt that nudge to start the men's ministry. Morgan and Frank having a burden for homeless people in the Raleigh area and starting the homeless ministry, which, Amy Williams is kind of carrying on now. Or Kathy and Cindy feeling a nudge because of their experiences to start a grief share ministry. Or Andrea starting a prayer ministry, just saying, I feel like I want to do something related to prayer. That was her calling or her nudge. And, whatever, the list could go on and on. But let me ask you, what is your personal ministry? Do you feel that nudge? And if so, are you resisting? Maybe that's a test of your faith. But that nudge is not going to cease or desist. In fact, if you keep avoiding it, it may turn into bitterness down the road because of a path not taken. You can never know what hangs in the balance of the decision to follow a nudge. But the one thing you can know that hangs in the balance is the quality and strength of your faith. And I think pushing through our inadequacy in order to say yes to God for the benefit of others, other people, grows our faith. So that brings us back to the text I talked about earlier. What do you do when there's the nudge, but you're like, who am I? What can I do? I don't have much to offer. Well, let's pick up the story in Matthew chapter 14, verse 13. And just a little bit of context here. Right before this story begins, Jesus had just learned about the death of John the Baptist, who was a monumental figure, a great man of faith, his forerunner who announced his arrival And he's sad. I mean, it's a painful loss, and he feels the need to withdraw and pray for a while. And kind of another note on that point is we see here that even though John was a great man of faith, John the Baptist, and this series talks about how God comes through for us when we go out on a limb and we take steps of faith, and that builds our faith. It doesn't mean that things always play out exactly the way we want. You know, God does not always give us what we want when we act in faith, but he always provides the things that really matter. And I'm guessing that John the Baptist, if he could rewind and do it all over again, because of the thrill and the meaning and the purpose of pointing people to Jesus, that gave his life, it transcended, it was more important than life itself. I suspect he would just do it all over the same way again. All right, well, let's start reading this passage here. We're going to pick it up in verse 13. And it says, when Jesus heard what had happened, this was hearing about John the Baptist, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. And hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, this is a remote place and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food. And now we're almost caught up to where we left off earlier. And notice the disciples asked Jesus to do something, but rather than just do it, Jesus turns the table and asks them to do something. Verse 16, Jesus replied, they do not need to go away. And here we are. You give them something to eat. There's a problem, and Jesus invites them, and he invites us to be part of the solution. But what he asked them to do seemed impossible. Now, in one of the other accounts of this story, we learn that a boy came forward and offered his lunch, gave it to Andrew. And Andrew speaks up, and that's where the visual aid comes into play. If this were modern day, you know, I can just imagine that young kid coming up with his 2 fish sticks and maybe a side of mac and cheese and looking at a crowd that's got to be, you know, dozens of times larger than this one saying, well, I've got this. I'll give credit to Andrew for not just dismissing him and saying, I don't know how, but, you know, he goes to Jesus and presents what he's found. And, you know, I love Jesus' response here because it shows how big problems can be solved. And I think it's an invitation to all of us. I just picture him smiling at, you know, this lunchbox and saying in verse 18, bring them here to me, those loaves of those 2 fishes and the loaves of bread. Bring me what you have. And every Jesus follower is invited to do just that. You want me to do something big in your life? Just bring me what you have. You know, you may feel like that kid with just your little box package of talents and gifts and abilities. We've all got, you know, a different mix of fish and loaves of bread, some more one than the other, some less of it all. But we all have something to which Jesus says, bring me what you have. And what did the disciples do? They did what they knew how to do. And they trusted that Jesus would do what only he could do. And so the story continues as Andrew gives Jesus the loaves and the fishes, and I'm sure he thought to himself, this is going to be interesting. And in verse 19 we read, Jesus says, and he directed the people to sit down on the grass, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples. And I just imagine, you know, if I'm one of those 12 disciples, I get like my 1/6 of a piece of fish and a half a loaf of bread. You know, here's your section. There's, 700 people over there. Distribute this. I would have thought, I've got to be crazy for doing this. But They did what they knew how to do, and they trusted Jesus that he would do what only he could do. They walked into the crowds, hoping he would come through. Verse 19, and the disciples gave them to the people. Their faith intersected with God's faithfulness, and then something remarkable happened. They all ate and were satisfied. Verse 20, and the disciples picked up the 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. Not only did Jesus come through, but he came through in a way far greater than they ever imagined. And I think out of this story, we can kind of adopt this motto that says, okay, I'm going to do what I can do. And just like these guys, I'm going to trust God to do what only he can do. And that's the walk that builds our faith. Well, at the beginning of this series, Kathy opened by asking the question, have you ever known someone whose faith seems unshakable? I mean, they live in a different world. No matter their circumstances, their faith and hope is strong. Well, I thought back to a friend of mine named Scott. He's a guy I met in college. We became friends. He's a big guy, was a high school football player, but a gentle spirit. And I have these fond memories of us, visiting his parents' home, water skiing on Lake Shelbyville in Illinois. And he had this active faith and this love for Jesus and other people it's rare. I mean, he became a teacher and he started working with special needs students, and I know that's challenging, and yet he loved it, and he loved his kids. He and his wife helped out with children's ministry in their church. But little did he know that there were unimaginable challenges, at that time anyway, that lie ahead. After their daughter was born, his wife developed a severe case of lupus and couldn't work anymore. She stayed home. They went down to a single income. Then one relative who was just addicted to drugs, couldn't seem to get out of that, could no longer care for her 2 teenage daughters. So Scott and Terry took them in, adopted them as their own. And man, were those girls rebellious, angry. And yet they dug in, they never gave up on them. Scott once told me, he said, Phil, if the only thing you ever accomplish with your kids is teaching them to love Jesus, you've done okay. After that, his parents both became unable to care for themselves. They moved in, lived with him for years. One had severe dementia, eventually passing one after the other. And then in the middle of all that, their one biological daughter developed chronic fatigue syndrome. So crippling, she had to drop out of school and never live a normal life. And Scott, again, on just a teacher's income, went around the country trying to find doctors who could help. And then one fateful day, they went in to wake her. She hadn't come out for breakfast, the daughter, and found that she had died in her sleep. And I look at that, I can't imagine such unimaginable loss, challenge, and heartache. I would say to Scott, you're my hero of faith. I don't know how you do it. But it wasn't over. In 2014, he received or maybe it was 15, a cancer diagnosis for himself that was terminal and that would end his life. The last time I saw him was in 2016. We went out to a favorite Chinese restaurant. We're sitting talking. And typical Scott, Phil, how are you doing? He would always take this interest in me. And I'm like, how am I? I'm thinking to myself, how am I doing? Man, I'm doing great. And he said to me, I don't know why God has made this part of my story. But I know God is good. And he's faithful. I've just seen him show up again and again in so many ways that I have no doubts, and life is good. And I think that Scott, perhaps like, John the Baptist and many of Jesus' followers, knew that some things are more important than life itself. Knowing your purpose your future, being enriched by investing in other people's lives. Make it all worthwhile no matter what lies ahead, what struggles you may face. And I'm convinced his faith was so strong in large part because he had a personal ministry that encompassed his job, his church, his family, his friends. It touched every part of his life and made it rich and overflowing with love and joy. Well, he passed away in 2017, and I flew to Chicago to go to the funeral. And he and his wife went to this mega church. And they were just ordinary, volunteers in children's ministry. I thought, they're going to have the service in probably the chapel. To my surprise, it was in the main auditorium. That place seats a few thousand. And it looked full. And they had the A-string worship team there. There was a 50 or so piece children's choir made up of former students of Scott's, as well as current students. There were no doubt hundreds of unchurched parents there, all in one place for the first time, spanning years of his teaching. There was a great message by the pastor, and Scott's story was told to everyone there of a man who lived well, who was a person of faith that never wavered, who loved God and loved people. It was powerful, and I thought, even in the story of his life that resulted in his end, his ministry continued. He reached more people maybe then than in his life. And I think the real hero of Scott's story, I used to say it's you, Scott, but it's Jesus. Because only Jesus can make our story one worth telling, one worth living. Only he can give us the confidence through responding over years to all those acts of faith so that we can face the impossible wherever that leads us with joy and hope. He meets our deepest needs. So what will your story be? What legacy will you leave behind? Personal ministry does two things for us. First of all, it allows us to experience God's power in our weakness. Secondly, personal ministry allows us to experience God's faithfulness in response to our acts of faith. And people who have said yes to faith have not only seen that, but they've changed the world. The disciples met with Jesus one last time in Matthew chapter 28 before he left, and he gave them one more impossible request. Go make disciples of all the nations. Impossible, yes, and yet here we are 2,000 years ago, and there are Christians all around the globe. You probably know someone who said yes to faith, who changed your world. But let me ask you this. What about those people who only believed but never acted? Do you remember any of those people? Probably not. We don't even know their names. So once again, I lift my Spidey lunchbox and just repeat that Jesus says, bring me what you have, your simple loaves and your fishes. Feed the people around you in a way that satisfies their deepest needs. Be willing to do what you can do and trust God to do what only He can do. And when your acts of faith are met with God's faithfulness, your faith will grow and lead you into an adventure you never imagined. Let's close in prayer. Father, we thank you so much for your love, for the gift of your friendship, for a life you have for us of such abundance and blessing and purpose and meaning. Lord, bring us to a place of saying, I want to respond to those nudges, not knowing the outcome. I'm going to trust you, knowing life may be filled with difficulties and pain, and yet in the midst of the pain, there's hope, joy, and purpose that makes it all worthwhile. I want a faith strong enough to face whatever may befall me. knowing that even in death, it's not the end, it's just changing locations, that my future is secure with an eternity with you. And so because of who you are, God, I trust you in all things, and I want to embrace this idea of loving people through a personal ministry. In your name we pray. Amen.